Thank you for the intro. Yeah, so from the well, how the modeling working group works to some of the stuff that we've done in the last 2 quarters or so, as well as a range of new models, which I think Vas will list, or possibly Leo will list. I know it's listed somewhere later in the platform, later in the talk. We also have come up with a new structure for statistical features. So this is explaining the motivation behind it. Originally, when we recorded statistics in the tabular models, we treated them just as new terms that needed to be minted. So we'd create a term for average temperature, another term for maximum pressure, another for minimum velocity, and so on. Whilst this worked early on in the process for small numbers of terms, some of the new models coming out, particularly the 1 or 2 from the DAO team, showed that it very quickly gets impractical once you start using a lot more statistical terms like this. So if you have to create minimum, maximum, and arithmetic mean for every measured quality that you want to consider, it significantly bloats the ontology. You have to do it for temperature, for pressure, for velocity, for length, height, and so on and so forth. 3 terms, just those 3 terms for each of those suddenly explodes very quickly, and that's before you take into account things like the median, the mode, standard deviation, things that are still quite common, quite useful, but maybe not quite as common. We determined that a new approach was required to ensure that we could maintain a sustainable ontology and represent this information in a uniform but standardized manner. So you can see down the bottom there, if we were doing it in the original way, those for just pressure and temperature, those 3 things, you'd have to mint those 6 red terms in the screen there, and that just explodes very, very quickly. So if I can, yep, okay. So in a first pass approach earlier in the year, we attempted to reuse our existing document pattern to create a statistics document. That was intended to basically collect up the statistical feature, which is the thing we were measuring, the quality, temperature, pressure, along with the statistic concept, the maximum value, the minimum value. So for the first pass, this worked in a semantic sense, but we found on the implementation side that it had quite a few limitations. One of which was the original approach meant that the value in unit ended up linked to that statistical term, so arithmetic mean or maximum value, instead of the quality being measured, temperature or pressure. As a result, because of the way the shapes for the ADM and the ASM work, we could no longer actually specify a specific unit, because arithmetic mean for temperature doesn't have the same unit as arithmetic mean for pressure or for velocity. You have this problem that when the key is hooked to that, when the unit is hooked to that specific key, you can't restrict it because that key might be used in other places. So we had that problem, which was a significant concern. The other issue that was raised, again, particularly from our DAO colleagues, was that the representation for these statistical constructs was actually quite a lot different to a standard temperature has a value in a unit. Now we have arithmetic mean that has a value in unit, and you've got to look somewhere else to find that it's at temperature. It was different enough that it had to be implemented quite differently in software, which added a certain amount of challenge to working with that approach. We also found that it interacted differently with other modeling patterns that we had. So when we had other constructs that required extra information. So I think the example we had was a chord modulus, where you have to specify at a certain strain. We had a pattern to represent that, but when you then combine that with a statistic, it became confusing as to which approach you might use. So we tried this as an initial approach. We found that this didn't work in the earlier version of those models. So as a result, we've refreshed it. We've gone through a few iterations, and the latest approach that we have opted to take is to extend the core leaf node pattern of this value and unit, which any of you who have used our tabular graph or simple models will have seen at some point. We're opting to extend this to allow an optional 3rd attribute, which will be the statistical role. So as a result, The statistics then become members of a statistics document, so we can collect all the related statistics together. If you have a minimum, a mean, a maximum, they all live under the same statistics document, and then each of them has an individual third attribute saying this one's the mean, this one's the maximum, this one's the minimum. Using this approach, we basically maintain compatibility with the original representation. It's still a temperature, it still has a value in a unit, it just has an extra flag to say whether it's a statistic or not. Because we're now representing it as a temperature with a value in unit, a pressure with a value in unit, we can now retain control of those units as well. So we can again say that an average temperature still has to have units of degrees Celsius or Kelvin, an average pressure has to have units of pascals or whatever. It still maintains our full semantic correctness, just as the previous approach did, and it's also entirely compatible with JSON representations for ASM. The translation process and some of the restrictions on JSON mean that we have to be a little bit careful sometimes when proposing things that would be valid under the RDF or the semantic approach and may not translate nicely into a JSON representation. This is not, this approach works fine, and we have translation planned for it, so that's good. The caveats to this, and there's always a downside, is as a result of this change to the core value unit pattern, we now have to update the tabular model queries, which have been stable for the last 2 years, I believe. They'll need a small refresh to pick up this new optional statistical role attribute. So as a result, any software leveraging those tabular model queries should ideally update to be able to read new future models using this approach. Likewise, and then tying back into Amnon's mention of the toolchain, that tabular model Excel template that we've been using successfully for the last few years, we'll need to do a small update to that to add a column for the statistical role. So you can say this value is an average versus this value is a maximum, or this is just a regular value, and we'll have to update our tooling to allow for that. So there's a new pattern, a new approach. As a result, we've got a little bit of updating to be done with our toolchain, but the strength is that it allows us to represent this in a clear and consistent manner without having to mint 5 million terms for every possible statistic under the sun. So this is a fairly significant change and a fairly significant update out of the modeling working group. So I count this almost more than the new models as a significant success of being able to come up, iterate with, and find a new approach that works both in a semantic, an implementation, and also just a pragmatic maintenance sense.